Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay, here we go. Going live. There we go. We're live.
Yay.
Welcome everyone back to the Comics Cube. I am talking to frequent guest J.H. Williams III. How are you?
Good. And how's everyone? How are you?
It's been a while since we spoke, but
Uh-huh.
I guess what most people don't know is that the last time we spoke on this channel is not the last time we spoke.
True. You came for a short visit here in Las Vegas.
I visited Vegas for a couple of days. I had a
Hang
couple
out
meals
for a
with
bit.
you.
Yeah, it was great to hang out for a bit.
It was hanging out with you and Scott Johnson. That was fun. And
Yeah.
visiting Ralph. I don't know how do you say his name? It's just Matthew.
Yeah, Matthew. Uh-huh.
Yeah, visiting Ralph Matthew in his store, Alternate Reality.
Yeah,
You
it was fun.
guys sold me on a Box Brown comic.
Oh, did you read it?
It is still on my very high list, but yes, it is. I've actually taken to having this big pile of books, and like now I'm just like, you know what? If I just don't like a comic, I'm just not gonna finish it. There's just so much.
I always kind of like, sometimes I get like that too, but then I think about like, well, maybe it'll pull itself around by the end, and I'll go, okay, that was worth the time. You know what I mean?
I agree, but how often does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Or sometimes you just come out of it like, okay, that wasn't completely terrible or anything, but you just don't walk away from it going, oh, I got to read that again sometime, or
Yeah.
you know what I mean? It's that way with any type of entertainment media, really. Movies are the same, or music can be the same way, It just depends on whatever mood you're in. And sometimes that makes a difference too. Like you come back to it and you're like, oh, I don't know why I didn't see this before. Why didn't I get this before?
I am warning. Please configure both primary and backup streams correctly. The comparison streams failed. What? Apparently something is wrong.
Uh-oh.
With the stream. Oh well, but we are broadcasting on YouTube. So like if anybody's watching this, can you please leave a note in the chat saying if you guys can hear us properly and if you guys can view us, because I'm getting a note here from Google saying something is wrong. I just realized I'm not recording this right now, so I'm just going to press record in case we want to go back to this at some point. There we go. So once again, everyone, welcome to J.H. Williams III on the Comics Cube. Okay, it's fine. They're saying we're good. Audio and visuals are good. Thank you to the three of you who mentioned it. Okay. Awesome. We are talking about a few things, a few recent projects of yours, but they have to do with Echolands. So
a little bit, yeah.
Echolands, let's get to the recent news that Echolands won at the French Critics Association ABCD.
Yeah, that was
pre-comics.
Very surprising. It's cool. Very surprising. I don't know if anything I've done before has been recognized by an international award or foreign awards compared to the US before. I'm not quite sure. Oh well, I guess Promethea got some Eagle awards, I think. Or maybe even Batwoman. I can't remember. But yeah, pretty cool. I guess it tells me people, there's people out there that have read the book. Which is good. I guess they formally issued the award in October, but made some sort of announcement. And I didn't even know. No one had been in contact with me about it. Because I think they informed the French publisher who does the French editions. I think they informed them. So I ended up hearing just from a fan on Twitter X mentioned
I'm just gonna call it Twitter.
Yeah, it'll always be called Twitter.
I refuse to call it X. It's so ridiculous.
But so I think, I heard from somebody on there, and I think someone pinged me on Instagram, but I wasn't sure what they were talking about, because it was in French, and I didn't translate it. It just seemed like they were somebody who was supportive of the book, and I didn't understand what they were getting at. And then, but when somebody mentioned it on Twitter, I was like, oh, well, that's cool. So,
You went up against, oh my goodness, look at this. You went up against Jim Terry's Come Home
oh,
Indio.
really?
You went up against Peach Momoko's Demon Days, Daniel
Oh, wow.
Warren Johnson's Do a Powerbomb, and the kicker for me, The Impending Blindness of Billy Scott by Zoe Thorogood.
Oh, that's a really good. Yeah. All those are really good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was the full list. That's pretty cool.
You want to hear the honorable mentions?
Sure.
Catwoman Lonely City by Cliff Chang.
Wow. Great.
Elric by Roy Thomas, Michael Gilbert, P. Craig Russell.
Interesting.
Miracle Man by Alan Davis, John Toddleben, Gary Leach, and the original writer.
Wow.
Red Room by Ed Piskor.
Wow.
The Secret to Superhuman Strength by Alison Bechdel, Holly Ray Taylor. And The Nice House on the Lake, volumes 1 and 2 by James Tinian IV, Alvaro Martinez Bueno. And Ultra Mega by James Harron and your friend Dave Stewart.
Wow, cool. All great material.
You won.
Yeah, I was like, that's surprising. I think maybe they responded well to Echolands trying to push expectations of the format and the way a story could be told. Maybe what made the difference there, because it's not like other books, and I think maybe that kind of surprised some people. I have no idea. I mean, without getting actual direct communication from them, I can only go by the little blurb that they put up, the little paragraph saying why they chose it. So,
of course, Echolands is the story of Hope Red Hood in the Echolands, which is a place where every land is a different genre, and therefore you draw it in a different style, and every character, therefore, depending on which land they come from, is from a different style, is drawn in a different style.
Yeah, the one place in the Echolands that is more of a hodgepodge of all these things is the land that we call San Francisco.
The melting pot.
Yes, where a lot of these different types of characters from these various lands collide.
And I just want to point out, so like this is a typical spread in Echolands, and that looks really good. You've put in a lot of effort into the way it looks compositionally, color wise, in terms of exactly what's going on, the flow of the panel, the flow of the eye through the panel. And if anybody is curious about that, we have over 6 episodes of the Comics Cube for you, where we talk about every single issue. So go look for those guys. So my question for you is, even when I was reading this in single issues, I was wondering if it would actually find more of a market in Europe.
Oh yeah, I've always kind of had that about my work. We noticed that early on in my career, that I don't know quite why, but a lot of the things I worked on would resonate with a lot of European readers. So I had a fanship really quickly early on with that market. And as far as like Echolands in particular, there's a lot of nods to European comics in there. Particularly sci-fi or fantasy stuff that they might do, but it's all filtered through what we do in Echolands, where we skew it a lot. And in the French edition that Panini produced, when I got my copy from them, I was shocked because it's significantly larger than the US version, and the US version is already at a larger size than normal. But it's big. I was really surprised, and that probably drew people's attention. That something like that sitting on the shelf, I guess. Yeah.
What do you think there's something about maybe not the European audience so much, but in general, European publishers that push their comics more as art showcases that helps you with getting this book over in that market?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think the other thing that it's hard for me to kind of comment on that aspect clearly, but I particularly because hearing in relation to this award as an example, another reason why I'm kind of surprised by it is because of the format. The landscape format is not something you typically see in Europe either. And in a lot of ways, a lot of European formats are possibly even more rigid in their presentation than the wide variety of American publishers. But their presentation is always lush and premium. But it's always, it's the graphic album shape, it's magazine aspect ratio with most of their stuff. And so it's all got a very similar presentation aspect. So a book like Echolands getting this kind of award is surprising to me in that regard, because we're just like in the American market, we're doing something that's a little bucking the expectations of what it would look like on the shelf. So
it's been a while since we've seen Echolands.
Yes, unfortunately, but that's the reality.
Are we looking at a specific date?
Not yet.
Or its return?
I'm finally at a point where the work is a section of the story where the process is speeding up a little bit. So all the stuff, the first two chapters of the next arc take place in Horror Hill, which is where the first arc ends, has the cliffhanger. The work in Horror Hill is so insanely time consuming.
Yes.
It's basically doing, giant black and white paintings all the way through those sections. And lots of detail, world building detail to really sell the place of what Horror Hill is. It's just crazy amount of time that it took. But then when we shift to a new location that is all inspired by old manga. And so I finished the Horror Hill pages, and it was so funny to me on a creative process level, because when I jumped into the manga stuff, the first thing I thought of, because like when we wrote the script for the manga world or city, we wrote them as double page spreads, like all of the rest of Echolands is. But then when I started drawing, I'm like, nope, these have to be single pages, because trying to for it to feel more manga-like, because the book is already going to mess with that perception of what a manga looks like just because it's landscaped. So I figured, well, let's not push that too far from the aesthetic and keep it to single pages. So I just decided where to break the pages. But when I started drawing that stuff, those pages, they went lightning fast compared to the Horror Hill stuff, which was surprising to me because it's doing techniques I'm not used to. But the only thing I can think of is there's a lot of manga I have a fondness for, particularly old manga. And so I was very interested in trying to capture that feel. so maybe because I was so inspired by that stuff is why those pages went quicker. And then there's no heavy rendering. It's all line work and textures, so those pages went really fast. The only thing I wish I had time for is to do some of the screen textures you see in manga on the board, like using Zipatone and stuff, but I don't have a steady enough hand for that. So some of the screen effects will be done digitally, but to make up for that, I did a lot of the art using old manga techniques where they actually hand drew the textures. So there's huge sections where I'm drawing in all the textures, like full walls that are like a very dense cross hatching or something like that texture to evoke that more retro manga kind of feel to some of that stuff.
At this point in time, having done your take on virtually every possible style there is, do you think you learn new styles more quickly than you used to?
Maybe. It depends. It's always a challenge because I never know what the result's going to be. So like with the manga thing, I was super nervous to try it, but was quite surprised at how quick I was able to grasp it. But a lot of times when I'm trying new techniques, I never know how successful it's going to be or how much of a slog it's going to be as I'm learning how to navigate it. So yeah, it was interesting tackling the manga stuff. It was super fun. I had a lot of fun doing it. And I made jokes with Eric Stevenson over at Image about it because I'm like, I was averaging a page every 2 days, 2.5 days, which is incredibly fast for me. Full on finished inks done in 2.5 days, where, on the Horror Hill stuff, I would be spending over 2 weeks on 2 pages. So easily. So I made a joke to him, like I said, my pace on this manga section is 2.5 days roughly. And he's like, oh, wow, that's fast. And I'm like, and I just made a joke, like, clearly I've been working in the wrong style all this time.
Been working in the wrong market. J.H. Williams III, everybody, write your questions in the comments. We will get to them. If you have any questions, we'll work it in. Oh, here's one right away. Mr. Williams, could you mention 2 manga titles you got inspired from?
Oh, it's hard to pin down. Anything by Tezuka, anything by Junji Ito.
Are we gonna expect some Junji Ito stuff in Echolands?
No, we don't go the horror route.
Okay, because I was gonna say that should come with a trigger warning.
Yeah, no, we don't go the horror route, particularly because Horror Hill is the sequence before it. So we wanted to do something that's extremely different than that. It has more of a traditional urban action kind of thing going on, but there is a little weirdness in there too. But I'll let people discover that when they read it. But it's just like a little action sequence as one of the characters finds themselves in a place we call Dragon City. Yeah.
I think, speaking of classic Japanese pop culture, you're wearing one on your shirt right now.
Yes. Love Ultraman.
Love Ultraman. Also,
I can see doing an Ultraman comic, actually.
Really?
Oh yeah.
You guys heard it here first. You can see himself doing an Ultraman comic. So yeah, keep the questions coming, everyone. Let's talk very specifically about, without any spoilers, this double page spread.
Yes.
So this is from one of the later issues, I'm not going to say which one, of Echolands. Did you realize that this was going to change your life a little bit?
Nope. When I posted a teaser of that image on social media, it was just for the fun of it, because I like how cosmic and strange the colors are. in it. So it was a fun, cool, here's just like this big breathy moment, and so I
Yeah.
published it just for fun on there. And
And can you talk about how this led to the Sound and Paint Men?
so I posted it, and shortly after it went up, I ended up hearing from a guy named Jason Zotos, who has had a bit of a music career, and he just randomly said, "Hey, I love this image. This is so cool. How would you feel if I wrote a song inspired by it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, why would I? Cool, yeah. Why? You don't have to ask my permission for that." And he's like, "Cool." And then he went off and started working on it, and then he would start pinging me stuff as he's working on it. And what he came up with is really good, interesting, different, and I didn't know what to expect when he said he would write a song. I had no idea. Yeah,
So at that point, he hadn't read the book.
I think he probably had or had been.
Okay.
I don't remember when did I maybe I didn't post that until, yeah, the issue might not have been out yet, right? When I posted that, because this all happened during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So the book was starting to roll out during the pandemic. So yeah, possibly he hadn't read it yet. He just saw the image and it spoke to him.
If he hadn't read it yet, then he would have had no way of knowing that you were putting music playlists at the back of every issue.
Yeah, I don't know. He probably saw my music posts, because I would take, whatever I put in those lists, also I would, tweet. So he probably was seeing those, being a music guy. Yeah, I don't know.
So can you talk about the Sound and Paint Men? As I understand it, for each song you're doing a cover.
Yeah, so basically the way it got started, it started with the song that he was working on for that. And then as he was working on it, we were talking, and he was like, "Hey, what do you think of doing a more collaborative thing where, he writes music and I do artwork. We trade ideas back and forth, kind of pick each other's brains to kind of figure out a way to make it a project that represents, ideas and things we're interested in and who we are personality wise." And that's kind of how it got started. And then he started working on a variety of tracks. And it's strange, because at first I was a little unsure what my role would be, because I'm not necessarily a musician myself. So it kind of ends up where, as he was working on tracks, he would want my opinion on different parts. And it's hard for me, not being a musician, what to pick apart. So all I could do was like listen to what's being presented and go, I wonder if this needs this or needs that. Here's some ideas to maybe throw that on there. Find ways to look for the tracks to feel cohesive as a whole, because he wanted to do it as a bulk size project. And so it's almost like a little bit of what he refers to himself as like soft producing. So where it's sort of, I through our conversations, he's inspired to come up with things. He comes up with things, has me hear them, then maybe inspires me to think of other feedback that maybe could be added or whatever. And then the final piece, or almost the final piece, I guess I should say, because he still did editing tweaks, would inspire me to do an illustration based on the song. And so each song has its own illustration. And then the package itself, the whole thing has a package presentation. So if people decide to purchase it on Bandcamp, it'll come with a PDF that's like 10 images. So yeah. Yeah, it's cool.
Do you find, well, you say that you're not necessarily a musician yourself, but I know you've been surrounded by music your whole life.
Yeah.
Did you find that it makes it easier for you to do that, even though you may not necessarily have? I guess what I'm asking is, like, when do you find it easy to give feedback, or do you find it difficult considering you're not a musician? Because
I think
sometimes
you're
when I'm
right.
talking to artists, I'm like, well,
Yeah.
I got
No.
feedback, but I'm not an artist.
Yeah, right. So it was more about when I would offer feedback, it would be more about like different types of sounds or like one of the things Jay and I talked about as the tracks were being worked on, particularly when you had the bulk of them done, is finding some way for the thing to feel cohesive and figuring out the song order. I got to have a lot of input on the track order, but one of the things we talked about early on was finding some sort of what he calls intros into the song, but for me it's just like a lead in to the song. So because finding ways for it to have those intros into each track have a little bit of a flow, so when you listen to the whole EP it feels like each song naturally leads into each other, if that makes sense. So that's the sort of conversations we would have. But on a technical level, I have no idea. I'm like saying, oh, start whatever sound at five beats in or whatever the heck. The technical side, I have no idea. So it'd be more about what it feels like, or kind of become those kinds of conversations. What it feels like, what we're looking for, what could make it more interesting. Like, conversations like, oh, maybe that track could benefit from, maybe we add horns, that kind of thing.
Do you think that kind of feedback is necessary for artists in general? Because, for example, like maybe two artists talking to each other, then they start talking about what would be the better artistic thing without any consideration to how the audience will end up perceiving it.
Yeah, I can only speak for myself in this instance. For me, I have no idea how the audience would perceive it when they listen to it, how they're going to respond to it. All I can do is know how I respond to it. Like when I hear it as a music person who loves music, hearing what Jay came up with, some of the stuff he came up with is like, because it's so captivating. Particularly, all the tracks are really fascinating. And one of the things that was interesting to me is that he didn't try to blow them out to where, like, if the track worked better being less than 3 minutes, then it's less than 3 minutes. So, so some of that kind of mentality is really sweet. And when hearing it, it's sort of like, oh yeah, it leaves you wanting more, which is always a good thing. So I would hear something he would do, I'm like, oh, that's so great. Should it be longer? Is what I would think in the back of my mind. But then I would ruminate on him, like, no, what he did there, it doesn't need any more. Or like the last track, Ethereal Drift, which was the first track that he worked on based on that image from Echolands. Every time I hear that piece of music, I'm fully sucked in. It's very it's intoxicating. It's almost it captures you and feels mysterious, which is really great for the image that it was associated with, this cosmic mysteriousness. It's really cool. It's pretty interesting.
We have a question we have a couple of questions. I'm going to get to the one by Timothy Finney first. Hi, Tim. How is that musical kind of collaboration different from, say, collaborating with Neil Gaiman?
Oh, really different. Primarily, so like collaborating with someone like Neil or any other comics writer or creator, most of those instances are you're both working in the same medium, and so any discussions around it, you're both coming at it from the same point of view in a lot of ways on what would make a great scene in a comic. Where with music versus art, because I'm the visual guy, it's much more reliant on the music side. It's much more reliant on Jay's talents on what that end music result is going to be. But at the same time, we both kind of work as if we're inspiring each other, which is very much the case. So like in the credits on the EP, that's how it's listed. It'll say, music and inspiration by Jay Zotos, art and inspiration by me, because that's sort of how it was. It was an evolution of conversations working towards a final goal. And like I said, at first I was really nervous about it because I don't have musical training, just my ear. And, the only time I ever dabbled with music myself was when I was really, really young, and I used to write songs and try to sing songs, but that was the extent of my musical ability. I don't know how to play instruments or anything like that. So I can only rely on what I hear and what our conversations are. It's a pretty interesting collaborative process, I think.
Of course, you were doing this at the same time as working on Batman variant covers and also working on Echolands. As an artist working on those pieces, what did you have to do any mental shifts or anything to get yourself in the mood to work on these pieces specifically?
No, I kind of like it was. I tackled it almost all at once instead of doing. Particularly because we had a main illustration already for one of the tracks. The other songs, I kind of let them ruminate in my head for a while, and then I just took a little bulk of time. It was like 2 to 3 weeks. Probably about 3 weeks total because of all the design too. Because it's not just the images; it's how they're put together and how they're presented in the album design itself makes a difference on how people respond to it. Or so at that point, I just did all the illustrations back to back, so I could just concentrate purely on that and not be distracted by anything else.
This may be a spoiler, or it may not be, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but working on these illustrations, did you think at any point, oh, I could use this in Echolands?
Maybe some of the techniques, possibly, because that's the other great fun thing about working on a music project is that you have a little bit more freedom to play with style techniques and imagery than you would in a comic. Even something as broadly ranged as Echolands, you still have to do things that are more adherent to what the story requires. Where with the music, you can be a little bit more open and let the image feel what you think it feels like when you are thinking of the song. The main thing I try to concentrate on, though, in terms of similarity with Echolands, is I try to do each piece with its own feel. So, but yet when you see it on the album cover, because all the illustrations sit side by side on the album cover, it feels kind of cohesive, but they're all diversely different. And they each
much like Echolands.
Yes. And they each I feel like whether other people will get that from it when they look at the art and hear the music, I don't know. I can only I came up with images. I feel like that sort of little graphic speaks to me about what this track is either saying or feels like. And just kind of went with my gut. It's a lot more instinctual and gut reaction. Very similar to when I was doing stuff with, Blondie and the Sword for their album covers. It was more like you kind of go with what your inner gut is telling you, and you're not so focused on the narrative aspect, I guess you could say.
Yeah. I think for people watching, I think it would amuse them to know that when you first told me you were doing something for Blondie, because I obviously am coming from a comic book orientation, I was like, Blondie, the comic strip?
Right. You're not the first. Yeah.
Is that still around? Dagwood. We have a question. Keep the questions coming, everyone. This is great. We have a question from De Utrora saying, I understand physical publishing is the goal, but Echolands feels so great to read on my 22-inch monitor, mostly because it's horizontal.
Interesting.
Do you think horizontal comics is an unexplored field in comics?
Absolutely. There's been horizontal comics like this before. It's strip art, as an example, like, if you go out and get a collection of, say, Dick Tracy comics, they're usually in that landscape shape. So that shape isn't completely unfamiliar, but I don't think comics tries to utilize the format very much in new productions, new things like Echolands, taking that chance to see what could be done with it. It's certainly challenging. It presents different mental challenges than working on a standard aspect ratio comic. But I would like to see a lot more of this kind of thing, but I know there's a huge resistance to it too. Not to knock comic shops or readers, but sometimes when people see something like Echolands, the way it's presented, there's a kind of resistance because it doesn't fit with everything else. And they want stuff to be all similar format is very common tendency, and not necessarily an unnatural one. But for me, as a big comics fan myself, reader, I adore comics in all kinds of variety of formats and sizes. And fortunately for me, like Alternate Reality Comics has no problem with that. My store that I go to, he's always had a wide variety of things in all different sizes and shapes, which I think is cool. And what I like about that is it shows that comics don't have to be the same shape and size and still work as a comic. It's a creative aspect, so it should be wide open, if that makes any sense.
S. Smiths asks, what medium are you using when you color parts in Echolands? So I'm assuming when you're coloring and not Dave. Yes, I'm sure that's what they mean. It's a variety of things. Sometimes I'll paint it, or sometimes it'll be a painting with a combination of Photoshop color, like what Dave uses for Photoshop. But my approach to it is slightly different than Dave. And the main reason why there's some bits I'll tackle myself, like the spread that became inspiration for the Sound and Paintman project, is because sometimes I'm seeking something and I don't quite know what it is I'm seeking, and trying to explain these esoteric things to Dave, it's not really fair to him, and then make him go round and round because I can't find what I'm looking for, instead of me just doing it myself. So, or there's times where I use a different medium, mainly just because I want it to feel different than anything else on the page. As an example for that is the rocket ship. Spoiler, the rocket ship that the characters end up with. It's in the back cover.
Yeah, that's all hand painted using colored inks and gouache watercolors. And I did that on the board next to the ink drawings, just because I knew it would feel different than anything Dave would bring to it color-wise, because I wanted the rocket ship to feel like it's its own thing, much like the characters are their own thing. So yeah, I jump around a lot, and people can kind of see a little bit of that example if they happen to come across any of the raw cut versions that we did, where they can kind of see those things on display and go, oh, that rocket ship is actually painted on there.
Yeah, I've actually got the raw cuts within arm's length, but I'm not going to pull them out. So
yeah, it's a mixed media thing.
Okay, Deuter follows up with, that's so interesting. Did you consider the rectangular aspect of Echolands would fit so well on monitors and digital devices in general? And what is your relationship with digital comics? Because you don't work digitally. I know that.
No. The only thing that gets done digitally by me is some of the coloring, which is typical, unless if I decide to paint it. So when I first started thinking about Echolands being landscaped, both Hayden and I, when we were developing it, did think about, well, what about digital presentation? Because downloading comics was becoming a thing when we first started talking about the idea. And most of my work before Echolands was double page spreads, but still in the portrait aspect ratio. I remember having a conversation with an editor at DC when they moved into the digital arena, and I was worried that they were going to make me conform to a standard size page, no double page spreads, because the average phone shape is that, right?
Yeah.
And wasn't really downloaded comics wasn't really, as far as I understood at the time, wasn't, I don't think there was a lot of thought about them being on your desktop computer. I think a lot of it was like, oh, portable. It can be on my iPad or my phone. And so that portrait shape was significant. And when I talked to an editor about it, I'm like, are you guys going to make me have to not, I can't do double page spreads? And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. I'm like, okay, because I was kind of worried because the double page spread doesn't fit on your phone so well. I think this is around the time working on Batwoman, and so
they have to hire you for you. They have to hire you for you.
I made a joke out of it. I was like, oh, good. I said, because I feel like the digital platforms need to catch up to me.
It's true though.
But when it came down to Echolands, we knew Echolands from the beginning. As when we started developing the idea, we knew really early on we wanted it to be landscape. And so how that related to the digital platforms was fascinating to me. And very quickly, particularly because we're dealing with double page spreads that are almost a panoramic feel to them, the first thing I thought of, like, oh, well, maybe people will turn their phone sideways. I wasn't even thinking about the desktop computer shape at this time. They'll turn their phone sideways or their iPad sideways, and they'll lock the screen and they'll just scroll through the issue, right? It was only until more, I guess, in the last couple of years is when, as the book was rolling out,
what it looks like,
where people were, I had some other people comment how much they enjoyed looking at it on their desktop computer because it fit that aspect so well. And I was like, oh, that's very cool. And it wasn't necessarily something I had fully thought out. But I'm glad that it worked that way, and that people don't have to like, oh, well, this shape doesn't fit my computer well, which is the problem I had with some of the double page spreads I worked on before,
Yeah.
Where this is a little bit more intuitive, I guess you could say.
Yeah. I just want to point out that Jeremy Adams in his latest Flash run has an issue where Dr. Fate is talking to the reader,
Oh,
and then Dr. Fate is like turn the book upside down, turn the book sideways, that kind of thing, which doesn't work on a tablet because it's
right,
going to
because it'll just
flip
keep
on its
rotating
own.
on you. Yeah. Yeah.
So, so that's unfortunate, but I mean that's also partly why I still prefer reading things on paper.
Yeah, for me, like I've tried to read. This is not, again, I don't want people to get me wrong. I don't mean to knock digital comics or web comics at all, because I think anything that gets people reading comics is fantastic. Me personally, I have difficulty reading material like that on a screen. I just don't feel comfortable sitting in front of my computer or on my phone or anything like that. It's hard, it bugs my eyes a lot.
Yeah.
So printed form is always something I prefer. And then on a, aesthetic level of tactileness,
Yeah.
there's something I always gravitate to in the physical aspects of something, the physical way it feels in your hands. I don't know. That's just something I've always gravitated to.
I find that the easiest ones for me to read on the screen are, ironically, the ones that you mentioned first, the strip comics. Stuff that you can just, something like Nancy, for example, Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy. Like if that shows up on my feed, I'm reading it. Like it's harder to not read something that looks like Nancy than it is to read Nancy. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And I think that the modern comics that I end up like stopping to read are a lot in that style, that very minimal Alex Toth type of cartooning. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's an immediacy to them. Yeah,
the ones with immediacy. JV says hello. Okay, there you go.
Hello.
The sound and paint, man, I think it is only apropos that you are working on a comic inspired by Echolands. On a project inspired by Echolands that is music based, because Echolands, a huge part of that is the playlists in the back. When is the Sound and Paint, man? I know it's soon. It might have already been out. When is it for release?
It goes live on Bandcamp on 9/26.
9/26.
Yeah, I don't know if it's at 12 a.m. 9/26. I don't know. Jay knows that. But it's 9/26.
Well, mark your calendars, everyone, for September 26th. That's only in 4 days. S. Smiths asks, can you talk about the honor award from the Gray School of Wizardry?
Oh, sure. Randomly, this was quite a few years ago. I think I probably was in the middle of working on Sandman Overture, or maybe it came during Batwoman. I can't remember specifically. It's right on my wall, actually. Listed as a master wizard. That's great. But randomly, I got this notification through email from the Gray School of Wizardry saying they wanted to issue me an honorary master wizard award from their School of Wizardry. And I was like, and they wanted to know where to send it. And I'm like, oh, wow, cool.
Okay.
And it's a cool looking certificate. It's got all these symbols and stuff on there. It came with a pamphlet that discusses what their goals are and things like that. So I briefly talked to them a little bit, and getting something like that is like, oh wow, that's like really, really cool. And I think it was inspired by the work that we did on Promethea, probably, because that deals with metaphysics so much. And
most likely.
Yeah, and this place apparently, has a lot of classes and seminars and things that talk about those subjects. So
Alan Moore is obviously the most famous magic-based writer you've ever worked with, but also it's Neil Gaiman and Grant Morrison also deal with a lot of those topics in their writings. So I
Yeah.
think that it's only natural.
Yeah. And it's just such a fun thing to say, it's like, I have an award from
The great school of wizardry.
yeah, it's like
That's
who,
awesome.
who would love to have that, right?
You can call yourself JH the Gray.
Yeah. So I felt very comfortable fully saying my nickname on Twitter is a mad wizard. So,
so that's where it comes from. JV asks, oh, here we go. What a segue. What kind of creative input did you have on Promethea, especially with how detailed Alan Moore strips are? And did your collaboration evolve during the run?
I had a lot of input, more than I was expecting. I was quite surprised. I'd say it evolved because I was a willing participant in talking about the things that Alan wanted to try to do. And at the time, my own creative ambitions on trying to see what I could do as a comics artist, like where could I push things? How do I do something that is unexpected and might be surprising for some people? I was very much of that mindset, and being an Alan Moore fan myself as a reader, I already knew that's where Alan comes from. Alan was already like, hey, let's what can we do? And so the fact that I was of similar mind allowed us to be able to be willing to jump off the cliff together on a project like Promethea. And I think it helped increasingly a comfortability on, oh, well, we haven't tried this. What if we try this and see what happens? So the experimentation process was fully embraced. And it led to other things, like weird things, like as we were doing the Kabbalah Quest storyline, the middle book, as the characters were moving into different realities, and he would discuss with me on the phone about, well, this reality, this sphere of reality means this and this and that. And I would go, that's interesting. What if we do this with the visuals with it? And that would inspire Alan in the writing process. Great examples are the issue where Sophie has to finally confront her father, her dead father. And I don't quite know why. So that's the other thing that was fascinating about Promethea. Promethea was very much, at least for me, and I think based on some of the things Alan would say to me in our conversations, was it's okay to let our gut, our instincts speak to us and do something we might not quite understand why our instincts are telling us to do X, Y, and Z. And that was a great example of that issue. And that's the one that ended up being all impressionist paintings for the reality as the character.
The Van Gogh one.
Yeah. And I don't know why, but that was what was speaking to me. I'm like, we should try this. And Alan was like, then let's try that. That sounds super fascinating. Also, same with, as they kept going higher into the reality, into existence, we end up with an issue where it's inspired by block woodcuts, like just chunky block printing, right?
That's the one where she gets her red costume. Yeah.
Yeah. And then it goes into a kind of a washy gray reality. So to me, it was almost, some of those things were instinctual about, because as she's moving higher into the planes of existence, things are being stripped away. So to me, like the chunky shapes of the block printing kind of spoke to that reality is a little bit more pure. It's not cluttered up with a bunch of textures and things like that. And then the next one is a different idea, as if the visual presentation speaks to the stripping away of the purity of reality, if that makes sense. You know what I mean?
I get what you mean. I gotta say, you're one of a very few Alan Moore collaborators that have told me that you have a lot of input on your collaborations with him. Because one of the things that the thing that I hear about Moore is that even though he says you're free to change up stuff,
Yeah.
like the thing that I hear more is, but I don't want to. Right, like they don't want to change up stuff because like he has such a strong voice.
Oh, right.
That,
Yeah. I can understand that. I mean, I haven't spoke to anyone directly about that aspect, but I would hear through the grapevine sort of things where people, some creators would maybe feel a little bit intimidated by the depth of detail in the scripts, and therefore maybe felt like I don't know, they're so overwhelmed by the detail that they feel like they have to like engage it in the way it's being presented. Where what I did was did everything in my power to address what Alan's asking for, but try to bring as much as myself into it as well without losing what he's asking for.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's maybe where somebody like Bill Sienkiewicz had a problem, because Bill Sienkiewicz is all about bringing, like putting himself in there, right? Like,
yeah.
And then forcing the writer to reconsider what's going on. Because you hear
Oh,
stuff
right.
about,
Where where Sienkiewicz might bring in narrative elements that weren't necessarily present in the script.
yeah.
Yeah. Where, yeah, I didn't necessarily do that sort of thing. But I did, I was able to add a lot of little tiny Easter egg type things and all that kind of stuff. But one thing, early on in the conversations with Alan, right away, he made me feel open about doing that. So, and one of the things that set me at ease is early on working on Promethea, there was one point where, hey, I'm thinking about doing this scene this way, which is slightly different than the way it's laid out in the writing, but it's still the same story. All the story beats are still there. Everything's the same. It's just the way it's delivered might alter, if that makes sense. And he was just like, if that's how you see it, Jim, do it. Is because and once I did that, I think he could see and feel comfortable himself that what I'm doing isn't altering his story.
Yeah.
If anything, what I'm trying to do is enhance what is already there.
It sounds like he's easy to work with.
That's the impression I came away with. I mean, any difficulties that might arise would have more to do with scheduling and how busy he was. To where sometimes you get to it. We quickly got to a point where I'm only getting a few pages at a time, which would, that presented its own challenges, but in some ways made me a better storyteller.
Yeah.
Not necessarily when I wanted to continue. So when other projects after came up, I changed some of my demands, but because I didn't like the idea of, piecemeal pages, particularly being design minded. So one of the challenges on Promethea is, like, as an example, on issue 12, which is the scrolling issue.
Issue 12 is one continuous image.
Yeah. And he wrote that in pieces. And so my job was to make it all align, right? But there was a couple instances where I'm like, hey, I'm figuring out this page here, but what's going to happen on the next page, so I can kind of set up that momentum of the continuousness. It was so funny because he's like, I don't know, Jim, I haven't written it yet.
That surprises me that was a thing on issue 12, because wasn't, like, if wouldn't you have just gone with the order of the tarot cards?
I don't know. I don't know what his reasoning was for setting up things the way he did.
Okay.
But so that was an example of, the challenge of like, oh, I have no idea what the next page is going to be, even though this page I'm drawing right now has to connect to it.
Have you ever heard? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, that was an interesting challenge. And the end result, you can't tell. It feels like it's perfectly orchestrated. The entire series feels like it's entirely orchestrated, but it was very much written a few pages at a time. But that kind of speaks to Alan's brilliance in a way that he can make it feel like, oh no, this is completely perfectly planned out every step of the way. But in contrast, when I took on Sandman Overture, Neil's another writer who's incredibly busy. And at first he wanted to be able to do something similar where a few pages came at a time. But by that point in my storytelling chops development, I was kind of like, no, I don't want to do that, because I need to know what the last page is of the issue so I can make decisions ahead of time that might inform what that is. And so I ended up with full scripts from Neil, not necessarily all at once. He would maybe, here's 5 pages, here's 10 pages, and I would just let him stack up until he got to the end of the issue. And then I would read through it. I would read what he would turn in, but then I would read through it again and again to see how I could draw connections from the beginning of that chapter to the end of that chapter. And that's primarily how I prefer to work. I would rather have that because I feel like it can make a stronger piece. I think with Promethea, the fact that we didn't do that, and it turned out as well as it did, is
magic.
It was magic and happy accidents, but that
threw me a softball right there.
But that kind of tightrope act is, you don't want to do that forever. So.
Jason Garza says the Sandman Overture Artists Edition is one of the most gorgeous books ever produced.
Oh, so thank you.
I have, speaking of just turning things in piecemeal, have you ever heard Gene Ha's story about how Alan slowed him down deliberately?
No.
he was working on one of the issues of Top 10, and then he asked Alan, like, what's going to happen next? And then Alan's like, I've got several scripts to do and I'm sick. So here, and then he gives him a 1 page of like one of the characters flying over the city, and he's just like, just draw the city. And then Gene had to draw the city for like 5 days.
Well, it's Gene. Yeah, he's gonna do insane Gene Ha stuff. Yeah.
Helen Everson says, I personally only buy JH books on digital or floppies because of the double spreads. The gutter loss in hardcovers can be a little sad. Have you ever heard about this format preference to your work? I feel like in as much as the gutter loss in the middle of a spread was an issue before, I feel like you have deliberately not put anything important in the middle anymore.
Yes. That's a painful lesson to learn. I still see that come up with other comics where someone will put something extremely important right in the middle, and I'm like, and you can have gutter loss even with a floppy with that occasionally, depending on what your composition is, or it won't align properly or something. So I very early on started trying to figure out ways that the most important information remains out of that zone. And then also push for things like, Sandman Overture, I can't remember if the regular hardcover is like this, but the absolute version for sure is where it's stitched sewn binding. That book opens all the way up. When we did the absolute version of Promethea, this was an interesting discussion I had with the editorial staff on that, where we were like, okay, this is a challenge. And this was one of the things that bugged me about the standard hardcovers with Promethea, where the TPBs was that gutter loss. And I said, I have an idea of how we could combat that. And that as the book gets closer and closer to the middle of the book, there's hidden spacers put into the pages that you cannot see because the binding that pushes the artwork out a little bit to where you can get more of that to show. On Echolands, in defense of purchasing a premium book like Echolands versus the floppy, I think that book does a really good job of opening completely wide and looking just as good as the floppies. There's only one page in there that bugs me.
Which one? No, I gotta ask.
I can't remember which issue it is. It's the one where Iris is first confronting Romulus in his throne room. And she's dead center. There's an image of Iris dead center of the spread, and I'm not happy with the way that cut. Yeah.
I feel that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that was an example of where, you know, I had a temporary loss of my own lessons, not thinking that maybe I could have handled that slightly differently. But when I drew it, I was all about the symmetry. When I was doing that layout and focused so much on the symmetry, not thinking I could have still arranged the symmetry to be different, to work the way I wanted it to, but change the angle of her figure to where her face is on one side, but
on one side of the spread.
Yeah. But you know, those are learning lessons, and you try things, trial and error, you know.
There have been two people that I've had on my channel where when I mentioned them to other creators, they have said, oh, that person's a real artist or that person's a real writer, right? One of them has been you.
Oh,
like
that's nice.
Another comics artist, when they found out you were on the show, he said that, like, oh, he's a real artist, I'm just an illustrator. Like, I think this person is doing himself a disservice. I'm not going to name him. But the other one has been JM DeMatteis.
Huh.
Because somebody found out he was on the show, and he said, and that person said, oh, like, I just write stuff. He's an actual writer. So with that,
I don't understand.
I think these people are doing themselves a disservice, but with that in mind, I think it was only appropriate that the two of you have recently collaborated on a novel called The Witness. Can you tell us about how that came to be? Currently only available digitally, right?
No, you can get it in print on demand.
Oh, okay.
So, and the examples of some of the print on demand books I've seen look pretty good. So I haven't seen a print copy yet, but they're supposed to be on their way. So the way that came about was JM and I have kind of talked on and off in small bits for a few years. I've always been a huge fan of his. Some of my favorite comics from when I was young were JM DeMatteis books. So I can't quite remember how I got a hold of his contact information.
I remember having dinner with you and Scott, and the two of us telling him, like, you haven't been reading JM DeMatteis? Get on that right now.
Yes. I think maybe I had, because we follow each other on social media. So I think when I was preparing Where We Live and looking for writers to write stories for that project, of course, he was somebody I would reach out to. And so that might, if we had talked before then, It might have been briefly at a convention or something, but really in passing. But I think our first real communication was probably for Where We Live. And of course, the story he did for that was just crazy good. When you read it, it brings me to tears when I read it. It's so emotional. And so that led to us communicating more. And it was also giving me the opportunity to express, how much I love his work. And then out of the blue, he contacted me to see if I'd be interested in doing a variant cover for what's it called, Layla and the land
for his demultiverse.
Layla in the land of, I can't remember what the realm is called, but he asked if I would be willing to do a cover for him, and I was like, of course. He was super happy with what I did. The publisher seemed really happy with what I did, and we both, even at the point of Where We Live, we both kind of like pie in the sky. If the universe is willing, we will collaborate on stuff, right? He very much expressed that interest. I expressed that interest. Then down the road, the demultiverse thing happens. I do that cover for that, which was super
called Layla in the Lands of After.
That's it. That was such a fun cover to do. I'm really happy with the image that I came up with for that. And then, of course, at that point, we both expressed, it would be great to do something larger someday. And then down, a little bit after that, he contacts me to do the illustrations for The Witness. And of course, I was like, of course, yes, I will do that. Because, he's a fantastic writer, Yeah,
what is Layla in the Lands of After is illustrated by Sean McManus, so it's kind of you and Sean getting the Wild Girl team back together.
Yeah, which is funny, huh?
Did you expect to ever hear that reference?
I love Wild Girl. That's such a great series.
I love Wild Girl.
I can't
Liam Moore, John Rapion, you, Sean McManus. What's not to like?
Yeah, it's shocking it has been reprinted. But so yeah, that's what led to The Witness. And of course, more conversations happen after I did the work on that, where we're both like, one of these days, if the universe is kind, we'll do some big comic series together, or maybe things will align. I'll get to do another illustrated novel of his someday or something like that. Who knows? But he's one of the best out there. There's always this sounds a little weird to say, but I feel like I don't want people to get the wrong idea, but there's sort of like a spiritualness in his work, but it's on a cosmic universal level.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And it really speaks to me.
Do you have a favorite JMD work?
Probably
is it Moonshadow?
Moonshadow. Blood is great. His Doctor Strange book was great. It's all good. I mean, I haven't been disappointed with anything he's written.
Can you believe that his run on Spectacular Spider-Man with Sal Buscema has never been collected?
That's crazy. I'm hoping that will change as Marvel keeps rolling out more and more omnibuy. But
it's like money on the table.
I mean, they're just now getting to Marvel Masterworks of his Captain America run. Mike Zeck, which is cool to see. But his Spider-Man needs to be reprinted. Why isn't there? Marvel's been doing these treasury-sized books, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen those?
Yes.
So they brought back the treasury editions size again, and they've been putting out lots of interesting things. The Doctor Strange book he did with Dan Green would be a perfect example for something like that. I mean, it'd be great.
Completely agree. So what is The Witness about?
Without giving away spoilers, it's about a guy who witnesses a plane crash at a relatively difficult time in his life, or pivotal time in his life. And he is psychologically impacted by what he sees. And he almost dies in the crash himself. He was driving on the road when it happens. And so the book focuses on, in my view, there's a lot of PTSD stuff touched on it without saying that's what it is, about him trying to rationalize what he witnessed, survivor's guilt, because he almost died with these other people. But there's a bigger universal component to it that will surprise people, hopefully surprise people. And it has a profound thing to say by the end. As usual with a JM DeMatteis story, you get to the end, you're like, oh, boom, right in the gut with what it's trying to say, or he has an interesting twist at the end that you're like, oh wow, I can see how this can go even bigger than what we're talking about right now. Yeah, it's a cool book. And the illustrations I did for it, I tried to focus more on the emotional aspect instead of ultra fanciful compositions.
Mhm.
I took more of a classic novel illustrations attitude towards the imagery. But at the same time, I also wanted it to feel a little bit pulpy, a little bit old pulpy type stuff, because some of the elements in the book has that. And so I kind of wanted to evoke some of that in it too.
So The Witness is out digitally and is available on print and demand. Go talk to JM DeMatteis about it, guys. So you're talking about drawing in a more classical style. Jason Garza is asking, how much reference do you need to echo another artist's style, or do you just absorb the work and work without references?
I work without the references. Unless if it's something really particular, like as a small example of using a reference, but only very briefly, just so I can remind myself, am I remembering this the way I think it is, or am I wrong? So in the manga sequence that we talked about earlier in the interview for Echolands, there's a background character that is part of this gang of thugs. He doesn't get a line or anything, but I pictured him as, sort of being influenced by the artist that does Fists of the North Star. Okay. So I wanted him to kind of have that a little bit to him, but not as muscle bound. So I had to remind myself, what do the faces on Fists of the North Star look like? And so I just looked at it real quick, and I'm like, put it away, and then let my take on that be present. So
that's how you find style, right?
Huh?
That's how you develop that style, your own style. Like,
yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, all reference goes away more. So it becomes more about my memories of it, my feelings of it. So it gets filtered. Those things get filtered through my relationship with it, I guess you could say, my love relationship with that. So again, the manga sequence that we're talking about is a great example of everything I'm talking about here, because it's loaded with a huge amount of various not retro, but old style manga that I adore. But I didn't purposefully say, this is this and this is that, except for that one character. And then even then I altered it and went with this feels like this feels like that, and then let's mash it all together. So there's stuff in the mega sequence where okay, as an example, there's there's a couple shots that take place in this empty warehouse garage. That when I drew it, I'm like, this is a Ryuichi Ikigami background. You know what I mean? I want it to evoke that feeling, but it's not a duplicate of a Ryuichi Ikigami background. It's like what I would see or what I would remember it feeling like. And so that's kind of how I bring that stuff to the board.
There is a misconception, I think, among non-manga readers thinking that manga is all just one style, but it's not. So even in your manga section, what I expect to see is a variety of manga styles.
And you will. It's most evident in the characters, particularly because we have this little gang of thugs that are picking on this girl. And I purposefully drew each one of them in their own manga style, but I did it in a way to where you can't pinpoint where it's coming from, except for that one character. They're all sort of like this mashup of things, but I treated each one distinctly different. I treated the backgrounds different, so the background styles change depending on, is it the outside of the building or the inside of the building. There's a part of it, we briefly see Rabbit, he's at a noodle bar. And the chef, we get one good shot of the chef in the background. He will remind of a cartoony Tezuka character, that kind of thing. But I didn't look at Tezuka characters when I drew him. It's more like, what do I feel? What do I remember of that? My love for that trying to come out on the page. And I did that throughout the entire sequence. And then the last page of the sequence, we get to briefly meet the ruler of Dragon City and their minion advisor person. And it turned out really weird because I wanted that to feel like retro manga, but not necessarily based on a particular artist. But when you look at it, you're like, oh, that's totally old school. And I ended up showing some of those pages to Brandon Graham recently, and he was like, that's so 1970s manga. I'm like, cool.
That was the intention.
Yeah.
By the way, I like how we came into this intending 100% to talk about the recent projects that you're launching and have launched, and we have spent most of the time still talking about Echolands. I love that. De Utrora says, I feel manga style doesn't exist. Style is like a vitamin, the result of so many things. It's really hard to pinpoint these influences precisely, so almost impossible to fit everyone in the same basket. He doesn't have a question. So.
I guess if you're thinking of like in terms of, is manga presented like what people used to call the old Marvel house style or the DC house style, I don't think that exists for manga, in my opinion. There's such a wide, diverse set of artists. If you go and compare Tezuka to Ito to
my personal favorite is Takehiko Inoue. So Vagabond.
Oh yeah, Vagabond.
Yeah.
Or the creator of Hellsing, or the creator of oh my gosh, Rumiko Takahashi. Oh my gosh. Or who am I thinking of? The creator of Tekkon Concrete.
They don't look alike.
So uniquely different from each other.
They don't look alike at all, right?
No.
So why do you think it is that that people tend to lump them together? Or is it a case, for example, where before I started reading Donald Duck comics, I thought they all looked alike. And then I started reading them and I'm like, oh yeah, that's a Karl Barks and that's a Don Rosa and that's a Mark.
Yeah, maybe because, as incredibly detailed as some manga can be, there still is this maybe a perception that it's a cartooning, and cartooning can maybe, unless if you're diving deep into it, can maybe on the aesthetic level seem similar. Also, just like any other creative medium, there's a lot of junk manga too. And a lot of junk manga does tend to start to look alike.
Yeah.
And people like, oh, manga means big eyes, little mouth, pointed chin, big head. That's the first thing that people think of when they think of manga. But some of the best manga isn't any of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always the imitators, right? It's always the imitators that give it that perception of there's a uniform look.
Yeah, but when you look at like a Shiro Tomo or Jiro Taniguchi,
Tayo Matsumoto is Tekken Kincrit.
That's it.
Thank you to Deutrora for letting us know that.
Yes. I'm terrible at remembering names, so I can cite you the project, but I can't cite you the name. How terrible is that?
I didn't remember. I didn't remember either. No, I gotta say, like lately with a lot of comics having like multiple artists and stuff, I'm like, or multiple writers, I'm like, I don't know which one is which, but I know I like it. Michael Edson asks, and he asks a couple of questions, and I think I know the answer to both. But the first one is, are there any plans on going back to your originally intended Batwoman final arc with Rucka? I understand a lot of time has passed since that collaboration, but your run with him is so special. Thanks, JH. I love your work.
Just to clarify for other people who might not be familiar, he's referring to Batwoman that I started with Greg Rucka. Greg moved on, and then Hayden Blackman and myself took over, which is the same team who do Echolands for all of you lovely people.
Echolands. I'm really hawking this like Stanley right now.
Yay. Unfortunately, we didn't get to finish out the run the way we wanted to. Our story got truncated, and we weren't able to give even a proper ending to an arc that we were working on. But our plans for Batwoman went well beyond that arc. We easily had probably another 2 years of story that we had planned on doing. Some of the things that we were starting to develop in the last arc were setting up like huge, crazy stuff that we were going to go down the road. So that was me and Hayden doing that. Interestingly, I don't know if I can say this or not, but I was recently contacted from DC to see if I had any interest in.
We are live. There's no taking this back.
Any interest in returning to Batwoman and doing our story. I told them that, well, with all the stuff that's been done with Batwoman since then by other people, I don't know if we could go back and pick it up from where we left off and have it work, because I wouldn't want to do it in a way where, just like if I was to do something in a comic that ends up being taken over by someone else, I wouldn't want them to disregard everything I've done. I'd want them to try to figure out, how do we work with what was there before and play it into a new direction. So that would be what I would want to do. I wouldn't want to pretend those other writers did what they did. So that makes it hard to circle back to where we were going. Just on a creative level, I just don't know if that'd be possible. They had mentioned well, and when I said, I brought that up, and they're like, oh, well, maybe it could be done something like a Black Label title to where it's its own thing. And I'm like, well, it'd be a minimum of probably 24 issues. And I don't know if I would be able. I probably wouldn't have time to draw it. My priority's got to be Echolands. And I kind of like laid out, here's everything we were going to do, so they have an idea and understand what I'm saying about the difficulty of being able to make that work with whatever they've done with Batwoman in the meantime. I'm sure if we put our heads together, Hayden and I could do it and figure it out. But is it something that we feel like we should do instead of what we're doing now? And it would have to be a no, because Echolands is something that Hayden and I have always wanted to do, and that has to be the project we put our most of our focus on.
You'd obviously have no time to draw it, but would you even have time to write it?
Probably.
This is also not Hayden's only job.
Correct. We probably, if we felt like we really in our hearts needed to do it, just for our own self-satisfaction, I'm sure we could figure out a way to do it. Hayden is a super creative guy. I'm creative. I work on developing concepts outside of Echolands all the time, things that are being worked on right now by other artists that I've co-written. So it is not impossible. It just does add to the work schedule and way life has been going the last couple of years. Time would be difficult. Echolands takes a lot of work. Surprisingly, I found myself in a weird mindset. I don't quite know why. So like when we were working on Batwoman, or when I was working on Salmon Overture, I found it relatively easy to put my mind into a writer's headspace when it came time to write. And, that was something that I focused on daily, at least a little bit. But this last year or so on Echolands has been weirdly so arduous that I have a hard time putting myself into a regular headspace for writing. Mm-hmm. I guess creatively, the art on Echolands is so I get drained, creatively tired.
That's what it would look like for the next section of Echolands.
Yeah. And so I find myself, even with Echolands, I've gotten to a point where I can't think about the next script until I have to.
Okay.
If that makes sense. So taking on another writing project that would be a substantially long project is difficult. So like the things that are being worked on right now by other artists that I've co-written, the scripts on those are done. So I don't have to think about them. I just have to think about, as pages come in, have to think about, does that line work anymore? That kind of stuff.
Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, taking on, like, if Hayden and I were to do Batwoman again and do it the way we want to, like I said, it'd easily be 2 years of storytelling. That's a big commitment when you already have a big commitment in front of you with Echolands. So
I get that. So with setting a sequence for a long time in Horror Hill and therefore taking up so much of your time, I'm going to ask you a question that I don't think I've ever asked you, but I do tend to ask writer artists. Does J.H. Williams III, the artist, ever hate J.H. Williams III, the writer?
Occasionally. So it's an inside joke in the house. Wendy, my wife, likes to make this joke because I'll be bitching about, oh my God, this scene is taking so long. Why do I have to draw all these zombies? And she like blame the writer. She's like, you have control over that. And I'm like, no, I don't. The story does. The story tells me what it has to be.
Right? How much of that is the story coming to a life of its own, though?
It is a lot of times. Even though Hayden and I always work with a planned roadmap, certain things will play out in a way we didn't necessarily expect compared to our roadmap. So it might take more time on a certain sequence, or surprisingly we go, oh, this idea we had that we thought we would spend a whole issue on, we can do it in 4 pages. You know what I mean? And so we take those opportunities if they're presenting to us like, no, this is the way to do it. Then we do it the way the new idea is telling us to. So the stories do take a life of their own a little bit. The character interactions sometimes can create new thoughts about where we were going. Like, you write a scene, say, between Rosa and Hope or whoever, or Rosa and Dina, and whatever they end up thinking about makes both Hayden and I go, oh, well, maybe that could mean this down the road, or it'll mean this in this other scene. So yeah, it kind of some things still write for themselves, but it's always good to make sure you have a roadmap to know where you're going. Otherwise, it'll lose its you'll go off the rails really easy.
Mike Edson asks a question I know the answer to. I would like to be the one to answer it, but you can elaborate on it if that's okay.
Sure.
How much are thumbnails part of your process? How many drafts do you go through with them? He does not do thumbnails.
Yeah, no thumbnails.
No, that's thumbnails. It. That's it. It's not part of his process. There are no thumbnails.
Yeah. I very early on, because this person probably they don't know this information. So very early on, my creative process is strange in the way my brain engages with being creative. So I used to do thumbnails, like parts of Promethea, I did thumbnails and stuff like that. But I found myself creatively being weirdly stunted by them, to where whatever the idea was that, here's a thumbnail, when I would draw it on the board, if what I was doing on the board wasn't exactly working the way it does in a thumbnail, I would fight what's happening on the board to make it like the thumbnail. No, it has to be this because this is how it works. But when I'm doing the artwork, sometimes the artwork is saying, no, it's not. That's not right. And so I would find myself feeling boxed in, and I didn't like that. So I started moving towards just having an idea in my head. I think about what the script is telling me, and I have that idea in my head, and I see it visually in my head, how it's going to function, and then I start drawing. But quite often when I'm drawing, it doesn't quite work the way I see it in my head. And by having no thumbnail trying to capture what I saw in my head, it allows me, I feel more flexible and have the freedom to make creative decisions more fluidly on the board. I find that a much more satisfying way to work. Even with Echolands, even though I'm the writer on Echolands, a lot of the creative ideas for visuals will obviously end up in the scripts that Hayden and I develop. And so in a sense, that's almost like a written thumbnail. Mm-hmm. But even with that, I might have an idea descriptively written for a visual narrative in the document. But then when it comes time to drawing it, sometimes I'm like, nope, I don't see it that way anymore. So that the spread's going to now work this way. And I even do that. I've gotten to that point with, like, when I do covers, I don't do thumbnails for covers. They used to be like a big thing where you had to get editorial approval for the idea for a cover, and so they would want to see thumbnails. And I always felt frustrated by them, particularly because one of the things I feel like the thumbnails eats up time when I could just draw it.
Yeah.
And so eventually I started slowly not doing thumbnails for covers as well. So what I do now, like if I'm working with an editor who's not familiar with my process, I explain this to them, and I'm like, we'll use the Layla from the Land of After as an example. Working with the publisher and JM on that, I'm like, here's the idea, and I kind of write it out the way I see it, how it would look visually, and I just give them a little brief paragraph description, and if they like it, that's what I go for. And and if any alterations happen in the drawing process, it'll still be true enough to the original idea that it's good, you know.
Mike follows that up with, when you watch a film or TV show or read a book that is in comics, do you find yourself adapting what you're watching to the comics page? Or are you able to turn off your creative side in order to enjoy the story?
I'm able to turn off my creative side and just enjoy what it is. Maybe it's a little bit harder when reading a novel, because a novel, you know, you're the interaction with a novel is that you're creating the world in your head when you read a novel. So being a comics storyteller, you can't help it, like, oh, this is what that scene would feel like, but not necessarily in a narrative way where panel by panel, but maybe more like, oh, this scene would feel like this if I illustrated it a certain way, or something like that. What I have a tendency to do that I can't shut off, that is going all the time, is when walking around, living my life, looking at wherever I'm at, a room crowded of people, talking to a friend, my mind can't shut off what it would look like if I drew that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Are you doing that right now?
Yeah, it's constantly studying the detail. Like right now, my brain is automatically studying the details of your face, where the shadows fall, where the light hits you,
Right there.
different expressions you have, like when you just smiled just now. All that stuff imprints in my brain, and I can't shut that off. So that's constantly going, no matter what I'm doing.
Helen Everson asks, you're a comic wizard. I hardly can imagine something you can't do.
There's plenty.
But when a vinyl record skips, do you simply buy another copy or just use the play the vinyl wet spell? I don't know what that is.
Vinyl wet spell.
I don't know. I don't know what that is.
I'm not quite sure I understand the reference, but okay. If I have a record that has a flaw like that, that's skipping, yeah, no, it gets replaced if I can replace it. If it's old and I can't find a replacement, then I have to deal with it. But sometimes, you know, a vinyl accidentally could get scratched or something. If it's like a little tick sound, because like it's got a scuff or slight scratch or defect, it depends how much I'm in love with the record. A lot of times I'll just keep that version of the record, as long as it's not super annoying. Like if you have a little tick that's going through the entire side of an LP, no, that's gonna drive you nuts. You're gonna want to replace that.
JV asks a question that I feel we get asked every time we do a live stream. So for everybody who doesn't, I feel like you know what this is going to be. For everybody who has never heard you answer this question, can you say the key differences between working with Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, and Neil Gaiman?
Well, on a technical level, let's keep it to that. Technical level, as everyone knows, Alan's scripts are notoriously detailed. As an example, anyone who's read Promethea and they know the Mobius strip spread, that was several pages, single line, one paragraph to describe the entire 2-page spread.
You know, the crazy thing is when I see Neil Gaiman scripts, I'm like, oh, these are also detailed. It's just like they're not in the same universe of detailed.
Correct. So Alan's is very detailed, but gives, like I was saying before, I have flexibility to do what I want, interpreting what he's written, essentially. And Neil's scripts, they can be detailed, but they have a kind of a different vibe to them, where Alan's very, I feel like Alan's scripts are very like, I have a definitive goal focused here, and I'm going to reiterate it to the artist 3 different ways. And so hopefully they'll understand what I'm trying to do. Neil's scripts, even though they're detailed, feel a little bit more like they drift. There's a floatiness to them. you can see the poet that Neil can be in his scripts, if that makes sense. Grant's scripts, my little experience with them, there's a chaos in them, random weird stuff where, like on a technical level, when I was doing Seven Soldiers, the first issue of Seven Soldiers of Victory, the font would change size randomly on the script, and then all of a sudden go back to normal size font, or it would change the font style. And I'm like, I was like, what's he trying to tell me? Because like one of the things I would always try to do with writers is try to see between the lines. What are they trying to tell me that isn't necessarily there directly in the writing? What do I pull out of it that is not necessarily immediately spoken, and apply that to the scene? So when Grant was doing that, the font, all of a sudden you have a paragraph and it's like 3 times larger than all the paragraphs, on the previous pages. You're like, wait, what is he trying to tell me? Something I'm not getting it. And this is hilarious. So I would call him and go, oh, am I missing something here? I want to make sure I'm understanding this. And he'd be like, oh no, my word processor got locked on such and such, and I couldn't figure out how to turn that part off. And then I finally did. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm not losing my mind. But then here's another.
They didn't go back for her to fix it.
It just like randomly would fix itself. But another example of chaos in one of his scripts is the second issue of Seven Soldiers. How he did this is beyond me. I do not know. But every page of the entire script, the sentence would start, and all of a sudden there'd be a huge gap, and then the sentence would continue. Drop down to the next line. Another set of words.
I know the answer to that one. Because I think one of his letterers messaged me after you and I had spoken about it. It's because Grant, the enter button wasn't working. So they were pressing the space bar to get to the next line.
But here's the weird part about it. If that's true, this makes this even weirder. So he would write, you drop down to the next sentence, and then there'd be another gap. But if you looked at the page, so in order to read the thing, I had to, because I would print it out and read it that way, I drew lines connecting all the sentences. But when you looked at the pages, they were clear slashes, perfectly aligned slashes through all the text. So if it is what that guy is saying, how did he do that then? That's really weird. So the slashes, when I looked at them, they all went in the same angle as the bottom slash of a 7. And I'm like, oh, that reminds me of sevens.
Of the number 7.
And so I was like, I didn't harass Grant like, why is this way? I just connected the sentences and drew the thing. But
it's funny.
How do you do that? It's so weird.
I would like once again, so for those people watching, when JH and I set up this call, we were like, oh yeah, this will take 30 minutes. Yeah. We have, of course, as per usual, gone over nearly 2 hours. So
has it already?
I want to talk about a tweet that you recently made, because I feel like we can talk about this quite a bit, and I'd like to get your thoughts and your further thoughts on this and to elaborate on it. You said, and I'm still calling it tweets, people. Okay. So you said, forever. Will so many comics ever stop making comics just to sell it as a movie or TV series? This seems to be the never-ending trend. Can't making comics for the sake of making comics be okay? I don't want you to name any names because I don't want to pick fights or anything, but is there anything that particularly triggered that?
Yeah, there was a post I saw well, again, I don't want to name names because people have their own reasons for doing whatever they do. I just get my hackles up a little bit because I'm in defense of our medium and what our industry does. But I saw a post that was a Hollywood person working with a known comic creator, pushing this thing that they were creating, this comic they were creating. But right at the outset, they're like, and we're shopping this for Hollywood, this and that. Right out of the outset, I'm like, so I see something like that. This might be my snobbery. I don't know, my comic snobbery, but I feel like, well, then you're not creating a comic to be a comic. You're creating it to be a movie pitch. And that's not what comics are. Comics are more than that. Comics are their own thing. And it's like, and I kind of feel like, again, this could be my own nitpicky snobbery. I feel like if the goal of creating your comic is to be a movie pitch or movie idea, rather than making a comic because it's a comic to be the best comic you can do, then I feel like, well, you're defeating the purpose of its existence. It's like you're and I also feel, depending on who it's from, it's a little usury of our industry. You know, people coming in to the industry thinking, oh, you know, I really need to have this idea. I have this movie idea. I can't get it sold as a movie. So maybe I can get it sold as a movie if I create it as a comic book. So it becomes it's
a pitch deck.
Yeah, like a IP firm kind of attitude, you know, and it's like, and I feel like comics are great. They don't, and then I also worry that if someone's outset to do that, then that's coloring every decision they make for their comic to be good as a comic.
Yes.
You're
intentionally limiting things like layout choices and because I think, for example, I don't think Jack Kirby particularly was adaptable for the longest time. You had to wait for budgets and technology to catch up to him.
Yeah, the right vision. Yeah.
So I think it does limit things like what, like, you're now thinking of, like, can this be filmed? Would we have the money to film this, etc.
Yeah, and I see a lot of it take place. It's been going on for a long time, and just every once in a while, I go into a curmudgeon mode, and I'll say something random like that publicly. And primarily because I love our medium so much and embrace what its capabilities are so much that I hate for it to be minimized in that way. You know, I feel like it's a minimizing of what we do, and or a way to exploit or mine what we do, rather than the people creating this, whatever this is going to be, that they're doing it because they love the medium. You know,
Yeah,
I feel like that should come first.
So, for example, like, taking this back to Echolands, I think Echolands is a comic book comic.
Yeah.
Like, it exists as a comic. It does things that only comics can do.
Yes.
But also, I think because it has a straightforward narrative, it's adaptable.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I've had a few people talk to me about, oh, it'd be so expensive to do. And I'm like, it's deceptive. It's deceptive. It's a lot of window dressing. But primarily, huge portions of Echolands are to have an urban-esque aspect to them. Granted, there's places like Horror Hill that don't, but there's scenes that take place in castles, and you can use all kinds of things to create that environment. Yeah, you have the random creature or the random thing here and there that would require special effects. But overall, Echolands really, when you break it down, wouldn't have to be overly reliant on expensive visual effects if it's consulted correctly. So if anyone wants to make an adaptation of it, please hire me as your consultant, because I could offer some suggestions on ways to do it where it's not going to cost you $500 million.
You should put that in whenever your option is like, oh well, you can make it, but I'm gonna have to be a consultant.
But yeah, good luck. Most of the times they're like, no, we want to do what we want to do. Just
no.
But yeah, as elaborate as Echolands feels, and part of that is because of what it does with the form. I think there's a lot of ways that you could make it very adaptable. I could see it as a video game. I could see it as a set of novels, television show, or animated thing. There's a lot of things that could be done with it if you have the right people involved and they're practical about it,
Yeah, I think, like if you get the right people on a movie or a TV show, like they would be able to figure out a way to make to take the core of something and then put it on the screen.
Yeah.
Like they shouldn't have to just look at comics that like are in grids and be like, oh, these are basically storyboards, which is another thing that I really hate hearing.
Yeah, right.
Yes. like comics are basically storyboards. Shut up.
Yeah, like no, they're not. That's it.
Yeah, De Utrora reminds us that Alan Moore once said about using cinematic storyline in comics. He once said that if we take this approach as the pinnacle of what comics can be, our medium eternally will only be considered the poor cousin of cinema.
Yes. And I think there's a lot, it's been going on for a while. I think comics, not all comics, let's be fair here, not all comics, but there's a section of comics for a long time that sort of, they've allowed that to happen. And have allowed a certain level of exploitation to take place. And part of it is, let's be real here. If Hollywood's throwing around a lot of money, that's easy to be influenced by. And I don't know what the answer is to kind of change that perspective. Part of it, I guess money does play a role in terms of comics, because comics aren't huge moneymaker things for creative people. And so I can't begrudge them looking for ways to get better paid for their creative output. I just want the medium to be treated fairly in its purest form and not be, like you said, cinema's
poor cousin,
because it didn't start off that way. It really started to solidify when there's always been, going way back in the comics industry, all the way back to the 70s and 60s, where publishers like Marvel's a great example, where they're like, oh, hey, we can make an Incredible Hulk cartoon or an Amazing Spider-Man cartoon and things like that. So there's always been this interest in translating the ideas into other media. But I don't think it became that. I don't think that was the driving force of creating those things. But when an incident happens where you have something like Superman the movie in the 1970s become this ginormous moneymaker, people start to look at it a little differently. And then not that far after, it's followed up with Tim Burton's Batman, which was insane box office, right? That's when this parameter really started to change, and Hollywood started looking at ways to mine what we do. And that slowly bred a culture of like, oh, well, that's the purpose. For some creators, not all, but for some creators, that's the purpose, is this medium is meant to be a stepping stone towards this other thing. And it shouldn't be a stepping stone.
And you know,
If it happens to
do,
become a film, great.
yeah.
That's cherry on top. But that shouldn't be the goal of creating a comic book, in my opinion.
Yeah, and like for me, like even if it is the ultimate goal of someone, can we at least make it good?
Right.
Can we at least make the comic good? That's it. Like if it's not, then maybe we shouldn't be rewarding it with more money. I don't know. That's just me. So uh my last question, because we have now officially been here for 2 hours. So thank you everyone for sticking around. My last question is, you used to work on Starman with James Robinson. You were one of the artists who weren't Tony Harris and Peter Snaberg. Tony Harris is very active on Facebook right now, talking about how next year is Starman's 30th anniversary, and he and James have a story for it, and they would like to convince DC to publish it. And apparently DC's on the fence about publishing it. What do you think about this? The fact that DC's even thinking about whether or not they should publish the 30th anniversary story of Starman.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I know James Robinson, but I haven't had an opportunity to talk to him about this, so I didn't even know this was something that they were considering doing. I think it's a cool idea. I would want for them, I don't know what their goals are. I would personally, as a Starman fan, you know, even though I worked on some of it, you know, got to do an issue of Shade, and you know, tidbits of some Starman pages.
You got to do way more than a tidbit of Sandman pages.
Right, different story. I would hope that a 30th anniversary story would be something significant. Like my hope is that their plans are that they're trying to convince DC to do like a 6-issue miniseries or something. So it feels like, you know, since we brought up Sandman, like when Neil wanted to do Overture, he made it a story of that mattered to the Pantheon. So if that's what their goals are, I think that would be crazy for DC not to do something, you know, that can add to the Starman library. You know what I mean? Yeah, I think it'd be cool.
So to recap, the Sound and Paint Men on September 26th. We're not sure what time, but sometime on September 26th on Bandcamp will be out. That is your collaboration with Jay. Oh my God, I'm blanking on his name.
Zotos.
Jay Zotos, yeah. And then your collaboration with the great JM DeMatteis is now out on digital and also on print on demand, called The Witness. And Echolands will be back at a later date.
Yeah, it's being worked on.
In the meantime, you should all get the hardcover for Volume 1.
Yes,
it's beautiful, guys.
And for people who've already read, you know, bought Echolands, I appreciate their patience. I get asked from time to time from fans like when is more coming, and I can't have an answer for it. I just have to reassure people that it is being worked on. But
someone on Facebook asked me, like, "Hey, do you know when Echolands is coming out?" I'm like, no.
The end result, because I just say how, you know, the work takes a long time. I had to do, you know, there was things I did in between, like those Batman covers, the Spawn covers, the Walking Dead covers that are about to roll out, that kind of thing. Primarily because, you know, I needed to fill financial aspects, you know, because the book does take a long time to produce. So I would have to do little things here and there. Of course, that just stretches everything out, but it's a necessary evil. So, but I just tell people, you know, it's being worked on. We're going as fast as we can, but the end result is I always get a response saying, "Please don't rush it. It needs to be good." You know,
absolutely.
So I really appreciate the patience of the readership that we have about it. Yeah.
I think I was talking to Mike Carlin right before this actually,
Oh,
and I was asking him as an editor if he believed that people should just wait for the artist to be done with a book or if we should get a fill in, and he said something like nobody remembers that Watchmen was late when it
yes,
was coming out.
yes,
Right.
exactly, exactly.
Oh, we have one more question. So everyone in the comments is now thanking you for answering their questions. But we have one more question, which is from Halen Averson, who, by the way, says that the water thing is you literally play the record with some water on top. It's an old DJ trick.
Oh,
I don't know
really?
if that's something you want to try.
I've never heard of that before. That's interesting.
He's also
I'll look
asking
into that.
if you had the chance to draw any European comic, and his example is Dylan Dog, would you take the opportunity?
If it's creator owned, yes. I've had talks in that area before with a couple of European publishers. It just never worked out for whatever reason. Um, there was actually a brief talk with oh my gosh, who was it?
Panini? Panini? No.
No,
Europe Comics.
um, um, what is wrong with my brain?
Is this a person?
Yeah, yeah.
Did
Female writer. She wrote Dracula, motherfucker.
yeah, I don't know.
I'm gonna look it up because we cannot let this go unanswered. The stupid of me.
Delcourt, Bonelli, humanoids. Keep them coming, guys. Keep the suggestions coming.
I'll have the answer in just a second. Duh. Alex DeCampi.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah. We talked briefly about doing something for the European market at one point, but just various reasons it didn't work out. I have other commitments. It's hard to make plans for that sort of thing when I have a long project in front of me. Humanoids that had expressed interest. Briefly, there was way back loose discussion of pairing up with Jodorowsky, which would be cool.
My eyes are just bugging out. What?
Dylan Dog. It's funny they mentioned I love Dylan Dog. That'd be fun to do. But at this point, at my age and with my career, I feel like any long-term bigger projects, I have to focus on stuff that is creator owned rather than someone else's IP. If times get tough, that's a different story. But
But would you take a break for Ultraman?
That's not a fair question. If it's a one shot, maybe.
You said at the top of the show you could imagine working on
Do
an
it as
Ultraman
a treasury-sized book. So it would actually be longer than doing a one shot because I would probably draw it ginormous. But that would be fun to do.
Thank you so much, J.H. Williams III. Thank you everyone for joining our stream. And once again, go the Sound and Paint Man on Bandcamp out September 26th. The Witness is already out digitally on print on demand. You should talk to JM DeMatteis about it. And you should all go get Echolands. It's available on Amazon or really anywhere else. Go to a local comic shop. Go to a comic shop, people. Okay.
Yeah. If they don't have them, tell them to order it.
Thank you so much.
You bet. Bye.
And there we go. We are done streaming.